Welcome, dear listener, to Candlelight Mysteries, where every whisper hides a truth and every shadow conceals a secret. Tonight, as the wind sighs against the glass and the flame trembles low, we invite you into another tale of suspense and candlelight. Let the mystery begin. Apt to fun, it began with the faintest clink of glass upon stone, a sound so small that only someone as finely attuned as Miss Jane Marple might have noticed it. The evening light had turned the lane of St. Mary Mead into a ribbon of gold, and the air smelled faintly of lavender and rain. Miss Marple, walking home from the vicarage garden party with her shawl pulled close, paused near Hollyhock Cottage. There, on the front step, sat a small brown parcel tied with pale blue string, its corners folded with a care that spoke of tidy hands. "Now that," she murmured softly, "is not the postman's work." She leaned on her parasol and regarded the cottage. Hollyhock Cottage stood like a painted toy house, whitewashed walls, green shutters, and tall hollyhocks that nodded gently as though gossiping among themselves. Mrs. Elspeth Daring lived there, a widow of a year's standing, known for her quiet grace and for never appearing at the grocer's without gloves. Inside, a canary sang somewhere above the ticking of a clock. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp as knitting needles, caught the small handwriting on the parcel's label, "For your comfort." By the time Elspeth opened the door, flustered and pale, the last light was dying beyond the hedgerows. "Oh, Miss Marple! How kind of someone. I expect it's from dear Mrs. Price Ridley, or perhaps the vicar's wife. People have been so very thoughtful since poor Arthur." Her voice trembled like china on a saucer. Miss Marple smiled, the sort of smile that soothed without promising. "A most considerate gesture, my dear, but curious, don't you think? There is no sender's name." Elspeth untied the pale blue string with careful fingers. Inside lay a glass jar of quince jelly, amber clear, glinting in the lamplight, and a folded note, "For your comfort." Nothing more. "Why, it's perfectly lovely," Elspeth said. "Homemade, too. How sweet people are." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the rim of the jar. A tiny crust of sugar, disturbed. A faint, crystalline dust, like frost, at the edge of the paper cover. "And barely there a whiff. Not of fruit or sugar, but something sharp and bitter beneath." "Quinces," Miss Marple murmured. "Such a delicate fruit." "Easily spoiled if one is not careful with the stones." Later that evening, tea was taken at the vicarage, and as always, gossip travelled faster than steam. Mrs. Hartnell leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Of course, it's none of my business, but that widow at Hollyhock Cottage, they say she had callers while Mr. Daring was away. A bookseller from Much Benham visits by bicycle every Tuesday." Miss Marple stirred her cup once, slowly. "Mr. Linton, perhaps?" "A mild-mannered man, fond of moral essays," Mrs. Hartnell sniffed. "Fond of widows, if you ask me. And she's not as young as she pretends." "Indeed?" Miss Marple replied, her tone mild as cream. "And yet youth is not always what tempts." She looked out toward the darkening lane, where the glow from Hollyhock Cottage flickered faintly through the hollyhocks. "Sometimes it is gratitude that proves fatal." The next morning brought a small excitement. Tommy Jones, the butcher's errand boy, came puffing down the lane with a tale. "Saw a man on a bicycle last night, ma'am, near Mrs. Daring's place. Dropped something at the step and then rang off down the road quick as smoke." Miss Marple thanked him gravely, slipping him a penny. "And did you notice the man's coat, Tommy?" "Dark, miss, longish. He rode with one hand, other seemed hurt, I think." When he was gone, she bent to examine the doorstep. A faint dusting of white marked the flagstone, as though the parcel had sweated in the cool air. Near it, a sliver of blue string clung to the hedge. She plucked it delicately and tucked it into her handkerchief. Inside, Elspeth was preparing breakfast. The jar of quince jelly stood proudly on the table. "I thought I'd open it for toast," she said brightly. "Such a pity to waste kindness." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Indeed, dear, but perhaps not on an empty stomach. One never knows with preserves. They can ferment most unpleasantly." "Oh, I dare say it's quite safe." Elspeth laughed nervously, but she replaced the lid all the same. Her hand lingered there longer than it needed to. That afternoon brought a visit from the vicar's wife, who carried the latest morsel of conversation like a bouquet. They say poor Elspeth's husband left a great many papers behind, business matters, you know.
Awfully confusing for her, Miss Marple nodded.
Papers can be troublesome. People often forget how much danger hides in simple ink and promises. Outside, a wind rattled the hollyhocks. The cottage seemed to draw in upon itself as though listening. Miss Marple noticed Elspeth's parlour smelled faintly of almonds, a pleasant scent, unless one had ever seen the wrong end of a chemist's shelf. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her window, knitting needles clicking in quiet thought. The parcel, the string, the clear amber jelly that no village kitchen had quite managed to produce before. She remembered Mrs. Blount's remark at the fete the week prior. Elspeth's quinces never set. Too much water in her sugar. Yet here was perfection, gleaming and still. She rose, fetched her notebook, and wrote a single line. Gift at door, anonymous, jar tampered, almond scent. Then, in her small firm hand, she added, test before trust. A soft knock startled her.
It was the maid from the vicarage, breathless.
Mrs. Daring's taken queer, miss. Said she felt faint. They've sent for Dr. Haydock. Miss Marple followed swiftly. Elspeth lay on her sofa, pale and trembling, the untouched quince jar glinting beside her. Dr. Haydock frowned.
No sign of poison, perhaps nerves.
But she'd best rest. When he left, Miss Marple sat beside the widow. My dear, you're safe now.
Only tell me, have you tasted it?
Elspeth shook her head.
Oh no, but the smell.
It made me dizzy.
Foolish, isn't it?
Not foolish at all, Miss Marple said gently. The senses often know before the mind admits. She rose to leave, pausing at the door.
Lock the jelly away tonight.
I shall call tomorrow with something rather safer, my own strawberry conserve. Outside, the air was heavy with the scent of hollyhocks and the faint tang of rain. A cyclist passed at a distance, the bell giving one small, mocking chime before disappearing toward Much Benham. Miss Marple watched until he vanished round the bend, then turned her eyes back to the cottage. The lamplight glowed soft against the curtains. Inside, Elspeth's shadow moved slowly past. Miss Marple drew her shawl tighter.
For your comfort, she repeated softly.
How curious that comfort so often arrives in disguise. She glanced once more at the blue scrap of string in her handkerchief. A harmless thing, unless one knew how to read the knots of human nature. Then she walked on, the rhythm of her steps steady, thoughtful, inevitable. Somewhere in the hedges the night stirred. The village, as always, kept its quiet secrets, and in that fading light, the jar of quince jelly on the table gleamed like captured sunshine, warm, beautiful and waiting, and Miss Marple, smiling kindly, knew she had just seen the first shadow of murder. Chapter 2. Morning came to St. Mary Mead with a brightness so sharp it seemed to lay every secret bare. But, as Miss Marple often said, sunshine only drives gossip into the shade, where it grows stronger roots. The churchyard lay still after Sunday service. The congregation dispersed in pairs and trios, each group a small parliament of whispers. The great yew tree by the vicarage wall stood sentinel as always, its branches bending low as if to eavesdrop. Miss Marple lingered a little longer than most, pretending to inspect a row of primroses along the path, while her ears, keen as a cat's,
caught the drift of conversation behind her. Terribly sudden.
You know, came Mrs. Price Ridley's clipped tones. Arthur Daring left the poor woman quite unprepared.
And those papers, well, one hears there's something irregular about them. The vicar's wife sighed. Poor dear Elspeth, always seemed so devoted.
But there was that little scene at the fete. She wept over the hymn list of all things. Miss Marple turned delicately, her lace gloves folded in her hands.
A hymn list, you say?
Curious. Oh, yes, said the vicar's wife, lowering her voice. Mr. Linton, the bookseller, was helping her. There was a misunderstanding, I believe. She told me later she felt faint at the time. Perhaps the heat. Yes, Mrs. Price Ridley agreed with meaning. Or perhaps the company. Miss Marple walked homeward with a thoughtful frown, pausing only to exchange pleasantries with young Tommy Jones, who was polishing the church gate with unnecessary energy. "Saw Mr. Linton again, ma'am," he reported cheerfully. "Yesterday morning on his bicycle.
Stopped by the shop for envelopes.
Said he'd something to deliver?" "Ah," Miss Marple said, and the faintest smile touched her lips.
Our village would collapse entirely without envelopes, I dare say. When Tommy had gone, she stood for a while in the dappled shade of the yew,
considering the threads that seemed to twine themselves around Hollyhock Cottage like creeping ivy. Then she nodded once, briskly, and made for the post office. Inside the little post office, Miss Perkins, the postmistress, looked up from her ledger with the brisk cheer of one who knows every letter's journey better than its sender. "Morning, Miss Marple."
Stamps again? I swear you must keep the Royal Mail in profit. Miss Marple smiled.
"A few, perhaps, but I was wondering if you had any recollection of a parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with blue string." "Quite tidy work, no postmark." Miss Perkins tapped her pencil. "Now you mention it, there was one returned last week. Never posted. The gentleman changed his mind, said it was for local delivery instead. I remember because the knot was perfect. Proper draper's finish like I used to do in training." Miss Marple's eyes brightened slightly. "A draper's knot, you say? Not a common touch these days?" "No, indeed. Most people just twine and hope for the best." As she left, Miss Marple paused at the threshold.
"And this gentleman, did he by chance ride a bicycle?"
Miss Perkins blinked. "Why, yes, he did. From Much Benham."
"Nice sort. Quiet voice. Spectacles." Miss Marple nodded politely, though her mind was already several steps ahead. That afternoon found Miss Marple at Hollyhock Cottage once again.
Elspeth was seated by the window, sorting through a stack of envelopes and old letters tied with faded ribbon. Her fingers trembled over one addressed in her late husband's neat hand. "I keep meaning to burn them," she said softly. "But one never knows what might be important later, does one?" Miss Marple smiled gently.
"Indeed not."
"Letters are like memories. Better to keep them until one knows which are best forgotten." Her gaze drifted toward the pantry door. The faint scent of almonds still clung to the air, though the windows stood wide open. The jar of quince jelly rested untouched upon the table, its amber heart catching the light. Miss Marple stepped closer, peering at the lid. It had been wiped clean, yet a faint, powdery line lingered around the rim, as though something crystalline had once crusted there. "How peculiar," she murmured. Elspeth followed her eyes.
"I wiped it yesterday."
"Just dust, surely." "Of course, my dear, though sometimes dust can be most informative." Later, at Mrs. Blount's cottage, where gossip was brewed as readily as jam, Miss Marple called under the pretext of borrowing a teacup pattern. Mrs. Blount was in excellent form, standing among gleaming rows of preserves that looked like jewels in the afternoon light. "Such a shame about Mrs. Daring," she began at once. "And that jelly?"
"I saw it with my own eyes, clear as church glass. I couldn't get mine to set half so pretty this year." "Indeed?"
Miss Marple asked, studying the jars. "I was under the impression Elspeth had little success with quinces." Mrs. Blount chuckled, wagging her spoon. "Oh, she hasn't the knack."
"That's why I say, that jar she got couldn't be hers. No one in this village makes quince jelly that clear, not even me." Miss Marple smiled, a small, knowing curve of the lips. "Perhaps she's had a touch of help."
From a friend who knows both paper and sugar equally well. That evening the village seemed to hum with quiet talk. At the vicarage, Mrs. Price Ridley leaned in toward Mrs. Hartnell as though sharing state secrets. "The vicar says Mrs. Daring's late husband had an annuity, not much, but steady, and there's some confusion over the paperwork. She'll need guidance, poor thing."
"And she's been seen twice now with that bookseller." "Twice?"
Mrs. Hartnell gasped. "At her cottage." "Under the hollyhocks," came the reply. After dark, Miss Marple, who happened to be sitting 2 pews away, pretended not to listen, though she caught every word. When the ladies departed, she lingered in the dim aisle, gazing up at the stained glass, her expression thoughtful. Human nature, she reflected, was remarkably constant, always a mixture of sweetness and bitterness, like the fruit in a jar of jam. The next morning dawned bright, but restless. A breeze carried whispers down the lane.
"Tommy Jones came running again. He seemed to live for errands. They say Mrs. Daring's had visitors last night, ma'am. Voices in the garden." "Voices?"
"Yes, couldn't see who. Sounded like arguing. Then the light went out." Miss Marple thanked him, and walked slowly toward the cottage. On the gravel path, she noticed small impressions, the neat tread of a man's shoe beside the slender print of Elspeth's own. Near the hedge, a crushed petal of hollyhock and a faint trace of oil, the sort used for bicycle chains. Elspeth answered the door with red eyes and a forced smile.
I scarcely slept.
So many things on my mind, Miss Marple. I quite understand, said Miss Marple. It's curious, is it not, how the mind grows noisy when the house is silent? Inside, the jar of quince jelly had vanished from its place on the table.
Elspeth flushed when Miss Marple's eyes found the empty spot. Oh, I put it away in the pantry. Out of sight, out of mind. Quite sensible, Miss Marple said.
Though I do wonder whose comfort it was truly meant to bring. As they sat with tea, Elspeth tried to smile.
You must think me terribly silly fretting over a little jar. Not at all, Miss Marple replied.
One might say the smallest gifts often tell the largest truths. A sudden noise outside, either the faint ting of a bicycle bell. Elspeth started, nearly spilling her cup. Goodness, she said faintly. It must be Mr. Linton. He sometimes passes on Tuesdays. Miss Marple looked toward the window. The lane was empty. Only the hollyhocks swayed, their petals trembling. My dear, she said softly. Sometimes one hears the bell before the rider has returned. Elspeth shivered. You make it sound like an omen. Miss Marple folded her hands. Oh, not an omen. Merely a reminder that kindness, like jam, keeps best when handled with care. That night, long after Elspeth had drawn her curtains, the church clock struck 10. The vicarage yew stirred in the breeze, its branches whispering secrets only the night could understand. And somewhere among them Miss Marple's voice drifted quietly in thought. Comfort, yes. But comfort for whom? She marked another note in her little book before extinguishing her lamp. Outside, the lane lay silvered in moonlight, and at Hollyhock Cottage, a faint glimmer showed through the crack of the pantry door, the jelly jar catching the moon like a tiny, treacherous flame. Chapter 3. The bell above the bookshop door gave a small, nervous tinkle, as though uncertain it should disturb the hush within. Dust hung in lazy beams across rows of hymnals, ledgers, and second-hand novels. Miss Marple stood just inside, removing her gloves with care. She had chosen her moment well. The morning post had passed, and Mr. Linton was alone behind the counter, bent over an open ledger with a pencil poised like a conspirator. "Good morning, Mr. Linton," she said gently.
A beautiful day to look at books, don't you think?
He straightened with a start, spectacles glinting.
Miss Marple? Why, yes, quite fine. I was just, putting my accounts in order. So industrious, she murmured.
One always admires neat figures. They tell such honest little stories, don't they? He flushed slightly, tucking the ledger aside.
Oh, just shop matters, nothing of interest.
May I help you find something? Indeed, Miss Marple said, leaning lightly on her parasol.
I'm searching for a small devotional, Comfort in Bereavement.
I dare say Mrs. Daring might find it useful. Mr. Linton's fingers twitched before he turned toward a shelf. Yes.
Yes, I believe I have one. As he reached up, the sleeve of his coat slipped back, revealing a faint dusting of white on his cuff, like sugar, yet duller in hue.
Miss Marple's eyes, mild as spring sky, missed nothing. When he returned with the book, she remarked casually, "Such tidy parcels you wrap, Mr. Linton. I've always admired that. So many people tie their string all wrong." He smiled thinly. "Old habit, I suppose. My father was a draper before me." "Ah," she said softly, "so you know the proper way. Don't you double hitch under the fold, thumb crease along the paper edge. A forgotten art." For a brief moment his smile faltered. "You've quite the eye, Miss Marple. One notices small things," she said. "Human nature and packaging are both best understood by their folds." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple called at the post office once again, ostensibly to mail a parcel to her nephew. Miss Perkins, still brisk, was sorting stamps. "Another package, Miss Marple."
"You'll wear out my ledger."
"Perhaps," Miss Marple said, "but I've a fondness for your ledgers."
"They're so much more orderly than some I've seen," Miss Perkins chuckled.
"If you mean Mr. Linton's, he could learn a thing or two. Always scribbling notes in margins. Half his entries are for errands that have nothing to do with books. Tonics, household sundries, paper glue, whatever that means. Really? Miss Marple's tone was light, but her mind sharpened. Curious indeed for a bookseller. Well, he's a helpful soul, runs messages for the widows and such. Carries things in his bicycle basket. Ah, said Miss Marple, so that explains the good draper's knot. When she reached home, she brewed herself a small pot of tea, the leaves swirling like thoughts in water. Her parlour was lined with tidy shelves and photographs of nieces long grown, but that morning's errand had left her uneasy. She set her cup aside and opened her notebook. Mr. Linton, draper's knot, white residue, errands, Style cover. Her pencil paused. Ledger entries, tonics, bitter almond essence. Outside, a robin sang in the hedge, but the melody seemed oddly melancholy. Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward Hollyhock Lane in the distance. Elspeth Daring's curtains were drawn, though the afternoon sun was bright, a small domestic detail that pricked at her like a thorn. At tea-time, she paid another call on Hollyhock Cottage. Elspeth greeted her with a fragile smile. "My dear, how kind you are to come again."
"Afraid I've been terribly lazy today. I could scarcely bring myself to open the windows." "Quite understandable," said Miss Marple.
Grief has its weather. Sometimes it fogs even the simplest tasks. Elspeth poured tea, her hand shaking slightly.
"I suppose you've heard the gossip in about Mr. Linton." "Gossip?"
Miss Marple smiled. "Oh, one always hears something in St. Mary Mead. People mean no harm."
They simply dislike an empty teacup of conversation." Elspeth gave a weak laugh. "They say he's after my husband's papers, but that's absurd."
"He's only been helping me sort them."
"Arthur left?"
"Rather a muddle." Miss Marple's gaze flicked toward the bureau. A stack of documents sat neatly tied with blue string. "The same pale hue as the parcels. Such very tidy work," Miss Marple murmured. "Did Mr. Linton help tie those?" Elspeth nodded. "He insisted, said it steadies his nerves." "How thoughtful," Miss Marple said softly, though a small shiver passed through her words. Before leaving, she glanced toward the pantry. The air held the same faint, bitter undertone she remembered. On the shelf stood the quince jelly jar, unopened, or nearly so. The paper seal was smooth, but a thin crack showed where the sugar crust had lifted. Miss Marple leaned closer. "Did you open this, Mrs. Daring?"
"Oh, no, only checked the lid."
It seemed loose. "Ah, loose," she nodded.
"Jars and people, my dear, are best kept tightly sealed until one knows what's inside." Elspeth blinked.
"Do you think someone meant harm?" Miss Marple smiled kindly. "I think someone meant something, and that's usually worse." Back in her cottage, Miss Marple fetched an old magnifying glass from her sewing drawer. On her table, she laid 2 threads, the blue string from the hollyhock hedge, and a scrap, borrowed, with quiet cunning, from Elspeth's parcel. Identical fibre, identical twist. She sat very still, the ticking clock marking each revelation like a heartbeat. A draper's knot, a tidy man, a ledger filled with errands for women too timid for the chemist's counter.
A jar sealed twice. She reached for her tea, cold now, and frowned at the leaves clinging to the bottom of the cup.
To most they meant nothing. To Miss Marple they told a story, fine lines crossing, circling, forming shapes. 2 paths, she murmured. One taken by kindness, the other by calculation. The next day she stopped at the vicarage for a brief word with Dr. Haydock, who was taking tea with Mrs. Price Ridley. The doctor greeted her with a chuckle.
"You look as if you've caught a chill, Miss Marple."
"Been up to detective work again?"
"Only knitting and errands," she said pleasantly.
"Though one learns a great deal about people by what they tie up, and how." Mrs. Price Ridley snorted. "If you mean that dreadful gossip about Mr. Linton, I think it all nonsense." "He's harmless," Miss Marple smiled. "I quite agree. Harmlessness, after all, is such an excellent disguise." That evening, as twilight deepened over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple returned once more to Hollyhock Cottage. Elspeth met her with anxious eyes. "It's happened again," she whispered. "Someone left something. Just a note this time, slipped under the door."
"No name?" Miss Marple unfolded the paper.
In the same neat, old-fashioned hand were 3 words. "Do not forget." "Strange," Elspeth murmured. "Forget what?" Miss Marple folded the note. Perhaps not what, but who. Her gaze wandered to the quince jar gleaming in its dim corner, and she noticed something she had not before, a ring of moisture beneath the lid, faint but telling. Someone had lifted it again. She straightened, her expression mild. "Miss Daring, might I trouble you for a taste of your jelly? For comparison's sake, I've been making my own." Elspeth paled.
I don't think I could, Miss Marple."
"The smell—" "Quite right," said Miss Marple briskly. "Let us not open doors that prefer to stay closed." Outside, night gathered softly over the hedgerows. The air was still save for the distant creak of a bicycle chain. Miss Marple stood a moment at the gate, gloved hands resting lightly upon it. Somewhere behind her, in that tidy cottage, sat a woman too frightened to eat, and perhaps a man too clever to stop trying. She turned toward home, the faint scent of almonds following her like an echo. In her mind, the pattern was nearly formed, the knots aligning, the ledger lines converging like cracks in glass. Once, she murmured to herself, maybe mercy. Twice as intent, her footsteps faded down the lane, as steady and deliberate as the ticking of truth itself. And the ledger closed with a soft snap, like the shutting of a door no one wished to admit had ever been opened. Chapter 4. The Women's Institute could forgive many things, but not a jam that told a lie. That was the mischief in the air as Miss Marple crossed the polished floor of the parish hall, where trestle tables stood like well-scrubbed altars to domestic virtue. Sunlight fell through tall windows in clean stripes, lighting rows of gleaming jars, strawberry with blushes, gooseberry pale as pearls, and here and there the proud amber of quince. Ladies in hats and sensible shoes bent over labels with pursed lips, and someone coughed in a manner that implied judgment without the inconvenience of words. Miss Marple, neat as a pin and twice as useful, carried a wicker basket containing 2 small saucers, a clean silver spoon, and a folded linen handkerchief. She greeted Mrs. Blount, the reigning queen of preserves, whose smile was the sort that suggested other people's spoons were never quite as spotless as her own. "Such a turnout," Miss Marple said mildly. "I do hope the Institute scale can bear so much excellence," Mrs. Blount preened. "One does what one can for standards, Miss Marple. And perhaps," she added, eyes bright, "today will clear up a matter of—"
"Provenance, indeed," said Miss Marple, as if the word had been about teacups.
"Provenance is merely polite company for truth." Across the hall, Mrs. Price Ridley hovered over a clipboard, tallying entries. Quince jelly, 4, gooseberry, 6, strawberry, 8.
"And one," she sniffed delicately, "unlabelled exhibit."
"We can't have that. It must be judged for clarity and set, dear," the vicar's wife murmured, her tone the kindly gauze one places over awkwardness. "Rules are rules." Miss Marple's gaze came to rest on a jar at the centre, quince jelly of such startling clearness it seemed a captured window. The label was neatly written, "Quince Jelly for Comfort," a charming title if one did not know how comfort might be misused. She touched the paper cap with gentle fingers. The string knot beneath was tidy, too tidy. Habits show in the smallest of ties, and this one wore its shop-counter ancestry like a secret badge. She looked to Mrs. Blount. "May we begin with a little demonstration?" "A question of light and shadow," Mrs. Blount arched a brow. "If you must." Miss Marple lifted the jar against the window. The amber shone and, just briefly, an odd opaline shimmer trembled within. "No proper quince will do that, not without a certain foreign friend." A whisper ran along the tables like a draught. So clear.
"How clever."
Almost like glass.
"I've never—"
And somewhere in the back, a soft, disapproving from Mrs. Hartnell, which could mean anything from blasphemy to an overboiled egg. Miss Marple set out her 2 saucers and drew a spoonful from the jar, letting the jelly fall back in a slow ribbon.
"A fine set," she observed.
"Yet I wonder, would any of you be so kind as to taste the aroma?"
"Not the flavour, merely the scent." The ladies leaned in. Mrs. Blount sniffed.
"Sugar, a hint of lemon." "Almond," whispered the vicar's wife, surprised at herself. "Almond?" Mrs. Price Ridley echoed sharply as though it were a moral failing. "Very faint," Miss Marple said. like an echo in the pantry.
Unwise hands sometimes caught almond where it doesn't belong. A ripple of unease moved down the line of hats. Mrs. Blount folded her arms.
You're implying trickery. I'm suggesting care, Miss Marple replied gently. Care and observation. She lifted the paper cap from the jar and laid it flat. The underside showed a faint ring where sugar had once sealed the lid, but the grains were broken and reset like a smile that had been put on twice. Miss Marple took her handkerchief and dabbed the rim. The cloth showed the tiniest sparkle, not quite sugar and not quite salt, and clung to the threads in an obstinate way. She folded the handkerchief again, neat and unremarkable. Gossip, being stronger than tea, could not be contained. Who brought that jar? Someone whispered.
Is it Mrs. Daring's?
No, hers never set so clear. Perhaps Mr. Linton advised.
Advised?
A man can hardly advise a jelly. In the midst of this, Miss Marple perceived a small drama of tone and posture. Mrs. Blount's chin a shade higher than before, the vicar's wife hand-fluttering at a stray hairpin, and Mrs. Price Ridley calculating distances between propriety and scandal with each breath. In such rooms, reputations do not fall, they are gently put aside. Shall we try a practical test? Miss Marple suggested. A drop upon a plate and a very small amount of heat. Heat? Mrs. Blount repeated. This isn't chemistry, Miss Marple. Housekeeping often is, Miss Marple said, with a mildness that smoothed the remark to velvet. She placed the tiniest smear of jelly upon the saucer and, with a safety match from her basket, warmed the plate's underside for just a heartbeat. The jelly glowed, then, not melted precisely, bloomed, a suspicious gleam like varnish. The almond ghost stepped forward and then retreated, too shy to own itself. Good heavens, breathed the vicar's wife. Some essences, Miss Marple said conversationally, are entirely proper in minute flavourings if purchased carefully and used sensibly. Others, however, arrive by means not approved by chemists and possess rather enthusiastic properties. It won't do, Mrs. Price Ridley said at once. We cannot judge it. Disqualified. Not disqualified, Miss Marple replied softly. Simply understood. At that exact moment, fate or curiosity sent the Institute cat along the skirting board. It sprang to the table with the singular entitlement of cats and flicked its tongue across a droplet that had escaped Miss Marple's spoon. A heartbeat later, it grimaced in deep offence, made a small, rough sound and leapt away under the piano stool. Dignity intact, though temporarily shelved. The ladies recoiled, a chorus of delicate distress.
Oh, mercy! Shoo! Even Mrs. Blount's spoon clinked in its saucer. Miss Marple's eyes followed the cat's retreat. A sensitive creature, she murmured. Animals tell us what they can in their fashion. That, dear listener, was the first overt shiver of fear in the room.
Gossip is sport. Danger is altogether different. One or two ladies began to remember pressing engagements elsewhere. Ladies, Miss Marple continued gently, I should very much like to compare lids. She lifted the suspect jar's cap and with deft fingers aligned it against another quince jar brought by Mrs. Blount. The caps were of different make, the ridges a shade closer on one, the tin lighter by a whisper on the other. A mismatch, she observed. Not necessarily wicked, simply unhousewifely.
Unless, and here she paused,
the jar had been opened and required a new cap from a different bottle altogether. A hush fell. Mrs. Blount's face was a study in restrained indignation and reluctant fascination. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, and her tone altered, still warm, but with a thread of iron, we should consider how parcels travel. Brown paper, a certain pale blue string,
a draper's knot.
Ladies, we live in a village where kindness is an institution. But kindness can be mimicked. She did not say, Mr. Linton, she did not need to. The echo of a bicycle bell seemed to cross the hall, though the doors were shut. From the doorway, Mrs. Perkins, the postmistress, appeared with a breathless look that said she'd arrived by accident and stayed by design. Oh, I thought this was the raffle. But since I'm here, Miss Marple, I've brought the sample of string you asked about. Draper's stop.
Only one shop in Much Benham buys this shade now.
The bookshop, well, they parcel hymnals, you know. Several heads turned. The air felt suddenly thin. Miss Marple accepted the string with thanks, touched fibres to fibres, and tucked everything away as if the comparison had been about darning wool. Then she smiled at Mrs. Blount. "Your quince, dear, remains the pride of the table. Would you do the honours of judging the rest?" Mrs. Blount, satisfied to be restored to her throne, lifted her spoon like a sceptre. Yet Miss Marple noticed the woman's next breath. It trembled just slightly. When domestic certainties wobble, queens of the pantry feel the tremor first. The judging continued with decisively cheerful remarks about set and flavour, as if a polite tide could wash away what had stirred the sand. Miss Marple circulated with the teapot, pouring calm where she could. Her mind, however, stitched quietly. Jar opened, cap replaced, sugar seal broken and reset, almond ghost, blue string, draper's knot, bookshop ledger. A pattern like a sampler emerging from small, patient stitches. Near the end, the vicar's wife drew Miss Marple aside. "My dear, do you think there is danger?" "There is preparation," Miss Marple answered.
"That is sometimes worse. And for whom?"
Miss Marple's eyes rested for a moment on the door, as if she could see through to Hollyhock Cottage and the anxious figure within. For the one invited to be grateful. The raffle was won, the certificates handed out, and the ladies began to gather their gloves and chatter. Weather, chickens, the price of sugar, how quickly the innocuous returns when it is needed. Miss Marple replaced her saucers, her spoon, and the folded handkerchief into her basket. Through the high windows a cloud slid across the sun, and the amber jars dimmed by a fraction, like lamps turned down. As she made for the exit, she found Mrs. Perkins at her elbow. "There's talk," the postmistress whispered, reluctance wrestling with duty. "An undelivered parcel last week, tidy knot. Changed his mind at the counter. Said he'd deliver it by hand."
"I shouldn't say, but, well, you did ask." Miss Marple patted her arm.
"You did quite right. Truth prefers a straightforward address." Out on the hall steps the afternoon smelled of cut grass and hot stone. Somewhere beyond the rooftops a bicycle bell sounded once, the innocent sort of sound that might accompany a cake delivery or a hymn book. Miss Marple stood very still. It is a peculiar skill, dear listener, to know when cheerfulness becomes a veil. Miss Marple had cultivated it as others cultivate roses. She pictured the pantry at Hollyhock Cottage, that vulnerable shelf with its honest jars, and the one that glowed too beautifully to be believed. She turned back into the hall for one last look, an old habit, half prudence and half kindness. Behind her, the Institute's bustle resumed, as though nothing had shifted at all, and, as teacups were gathered, everyone suddenly remembered an errand elsewhere, all but Miss Marple, who stayed to count the spoons. Chapter 5. The quarrel began as most village quarrels do, with a lowered voice and a raised eyebrow. On the edge of dusk, when the hedges go black and the lane turns to a ribbon of pewter, Miss Marple heard a man's tone harden, then soften, then vanish altogether into the hush near the old mill. It was not words she caught so much as intent, and intent, she had learned, could be heard in the spaces between syllables. Constable Pritchard was waiting for her by the mill pond, hat in hand and conscience on his sleeve.
"Evening, Miss Marple."
"We've had sightings. Cyclist in a dark coat. Same night the parcel was left. Passed this way near the fork. One rode for the station, the other for Hollyhock Lane." "How efficient," Miss Marple murmured. "Temptation likes a choice of exits." He cleared his throat. "Found marks, too." He led her to the verge where the hedge leaned forward as if trying to overhear. "There, narrow tread."
"And here, see the skip."
"Like a rim that hit a stone."
"Could have nicked the tyre." Miss Marple bent, the hem of her sensible skirt brushing a scatter of grit.
In the faint light she saw the delicate hieroglyphs of movement, a bicycle pausing, wheeling, deciding. On the hedge itself, a hollyhock stem was bruised, the petal crushed as if caught in a sleeve. She tucked the detail into her mind, neat as a hairpin. "Very good of you to notice, Constable," she said. "Bicycles tell the truth more readily than their riders." He looked gratified. "Some say it was Mr. Linton." Some say many things, Miss Marple returned gently. We shall see what the road says. The station master at St. Mary Mead was a man who polished information as carefully as brass. In his cramped office, timetables made a wallpaper of punctuality. He pushed his spectacles up with a forefinger and leaned in as if his news required confidentiality to grow. Asked after a locker. He did, the station master confided. Odd question at that hour. Had a brown paper parcel in his basket, then says as how he'll take a turn round the village instead. Changed his mind, see? A privilege often exercised after a plan improves, Miss Marple remarked. Did you note his coat? Dark, longish, could be anyone with a chapel habit. And the hands? Right hand gloved, left bare. Strange that with the evening chill. Strange, she agreed mildly, and thanked him with a small smile that paid for information better than coins. On her way back, the wind came down the cutting with a railway smell, iron and oil and old steam. Miss Marple thought of the note at Elspeth's door, do not forget, and considered how very useful forgetting can be when one wishes to do the same thing twice without being noticed. At the old mill, the daughter of the keeper waited with the purposeful idleness of the young. She had the look of someone who knew things before they were said. My uncle, she announced unasked, was a draper, taught a few of us proper parcel wrapping. Said the knot's the handshake of the shop. How very wise of him, Miss Marple replied.
And who among your admirers ties the best knot?
The girl coloured, then tried not to. Mr. Linton, ma'am. Practised, he did. Brought hymnals to the Sunday school once, each one wrapped prettier than a bride cake. Really? Miss Marple said, as if remarking on the weather. Hymnals and habits, both useful when one wishes to pass unnoticed. A swallow looped over the mill pond and stitched a thread of air to its reflection. Miss Marple watched it go, thinking how neatly birds managed their mysteries without leaving ledgers. Gossip, like ivy, will climb any wall. At the dairy, Mrs. Kelso, the farmer's wife, had a tale as fresh as the milk in the churns. Sold Mrs. Daring a good bucket of quinces last week, I did.
Fine fruit.
But she never sent for sugar, not a spoonful, and her copper shows no recent boil. My Elsie cleans for her on Thursdays. Says the pot's still got the old tarnish. Ah, said Miss Marple. A jar without a kitchen, like a confession without a sinner. Mrs. Kelso nodded, satisfied to have contributed to public safety. And I'll say this, there's a man's footprint near that pantry window. Elsie don't miss much. Miss Marple thought of the moisture ring beneath the suspect lid, the way the sugar crust had lifted and been persuaded to settle again. No, she agreed, Elsie doesn't. She made a note once she was outside, writing in her careful schoolgirl hand, quinces bought, not boiled, jar introduced from elsewhere, and beneath, comfort imported. Back at Hollyhock Cottage, the hollyhocks trembled in a wind that had not yet arrived. Elspeth opened the door at once, as if she had been listening for the knock. She looked thinner, like a photograph left too long in the sun. I thought perhaps you would come, she said.
It's silly, but I feel safer when you are, I don't know, looking at things? Looking at things, Miss Marple echoed kindly.
Is half the comfort some of us can provide. She went straight to the pantry. The familiar ghost of almond was weaker now, as though the room had learned to breathe around it. On the shelf, the suspect jar had been pushed to the back, politely exiled by the honest ranks of jam. Miss Marple lifted it, set it on the table, and examined the paper cap again. There is a word, Mrs. Daring, she said, which people use when they mean something they do not wish to explain. They say accidentally, Elspeth flinched. I never asked for presents.
Truly I did not, of course not.
Kindness arrives uninvited and leaves a calling card. They took tea. Elspeth's hand steadied only when speaking of the past. A bad sign, Miss Marple knew, for those whose future has been crowded by others. Arthur once had a turn, Elspeth said quietly, after a cordial. Dr. Haydock said it was only shock and a chill, but he gave up anything fortifying after that. Wise of him, Miss Marple replied. Some comforts need a label and a conscience. Outside, a bicycle bell sounded far off, bright as a coin flicked into a well.
Elspeth's cup rattled against its saucer, you see?
She whispered. Every Tuesday like church. Then perhaps we should hold a little service of our own, Miss Marple said. A modest ritual. We shall wait. They waited. The late light collected in the corners, turning dust to gold. A shadow crossed the front step, paused, withdrew. Presently a letter slid under the door with the soft, sly sound of paper being good. Miss Marple reached it first. Have courage.
No signature.
The pen stroke neat and upright, the downstroke slightly tremoured. The habit of someone writing while standing or balancing. Kindness again, Miss Marple murmured. How exhausting it must be to perform. Elspeth stared at the note as if it might explain itself if given tea.
Oh, I don't want this, she said.
I want quiet. One can provide quiet in several ways, Miss Marple said. Safer ways often involve conversation. She left Elspeth with a promise and walked the lane toward the fork. Night gathered with that peculiar village haste, the kind that arrives fully dressed and sits down without invitation. She went by the hedgerow where Constable Pritchard had shown her the tire marks and found them again, faint. But there, and something more, a fragment of pale blue string caught on a thorn, worrying itself free whenever the wind applied a polite argument. She teased it loose and, in the last smear of light, saw that the fibres wore a faint dust. Not quite white, not quite sugar. They glinted, then dulled, leaving a prickle against her glove. Not granulated, she said softly to nobody. Crystalline, but shy of sweetness. The mill road ran dark as a ribbon dropped in water. Miss Marple stood at the fork and faced the station, then turned to the lane for Hollyhock Cottage. 2 roads, 2 intentions, delivery or departure. A single rider could hold both in his hands like choices at a counter. A soft cough came from behind. Constable Pritchard apologetic. I couldn't help but follow, miss. Thought you might like to know. Got word from the draper in Much Benham. Blue string, special order.
Only buy a last quarter, the bookshop, for hymnals. How pious of them, Miss Marple said, without malice.
Hymns are excellent for the soul and for practice. He shifted, uncomfortable with what would not yet be named. Shall I have a word with Mr. Linton?
In due time, Constable.
Quietly and with care. There is no law against parcels wrapped too well. He scratched his ear. No, miss. But there are laws, she said. Against finishing a sentence one has no right to begin. The station lamps far off burned like eyes not wishing to be rude. Miss Marple set her steps toward home. Passing the vicarage, she caught the tail of a conversation drifting like incense. The poor woman, and that jelly, and the cyclist every Tuesday, only trying to help, I'm sure. Help is a banquet to the lonely. She kept walking. Gossip had done its work. Now the village would pretend it had done nothing at all. That habit is not wicked. It is merely human, and thus extraordinarily dangerous. At her cottage, she laid the blue string on her desk, beside the earlier scrap.
Identical twist, identical die.
She touched the dust again and thought of essence bottles with missing corks, of paper caps exchanged like alibis, of ledgers where errands masqueraded as charity. She could hear the bicycles of her childhood, the clatter, the bell. She could smell the starch of good paper and the bite of new twine. She could hear, too, her aunt's voice. When a thing is tied too neatly, Janie, ask whom it was meant to impress. Miss Marple smiled to herself, very slightly, or whom it was meant to reassure. She wrapped the string around her finger, felt its give, its stubborn memory of the knot it had been made to serve. Outside, the wind finally arrived, and the hollyhocks bowed once, twice, as if acknowledging a visitor too well known to introduce, and Miss Marple, threading the string between finger and thumb, felt the knot of the village tighten by one more turn. Chapter 6. Morning came draped in fog, a slow, thoughtful kind that softened the edges of St. Mary Mead until even gossip seemed to whisper through cotton. Miss Marple sat at her kitchen table with a pot of tea cooling beside her, the clock ticking as though knitting time itself. She was waiting for a call, and it arrived precisely when it should. 3 soft taps upon the window pane. It was Tommy Jones, pink-cheeked and earnest, holding an envelope slightly damp from his ride. "From Mrs. Daring, miss. Said it's important." Miss Marple thanked him, gave him a bun from the tin, and opened the note. The handwriting trembled across the page. "Please come. There are things I cannot keep quiet any longer." She sighed, reached for her hat, and murmured, "One mustn't let truth bruise from keeping." At Hollyhock Cottage, the fog pressed close to the window panes. Elspeth Daring sat by the hearth, hands folded, as though awaiting judgment rather than company. Her face was pale but steady. On the small table lay a photograph of her late husband Arthur. Serious eyes, kind mouth, the look of a man who had been ordinary until circumstances made him tragic. "I don't know where to begin," she said softly.
"I keep hearing my husband's voice, not ghostly, just—"
"Reminding me? Begin anywhere," Miss Marple replied, seating herself without ceremony. "Truth has no order. It merely arrives." Elspeth took a slow breath. Arthur was not a rich man, but cautious. He took out a small annuity. It paid regularly, enough for comfort. But there was an odd clause. It would end immediately if the company suspected foul play. Miss Marple's needles paused in their case. "Foul play," she repeated. Such an imaginative phrasing for accountants. "He was a careful soul," Elspeth continued, "superstitious too. After he died, Mr. Linton helped me with the papers. He said he'd seen such clauses before, that they were meant to prevent insurance mischief. He sorted everything. I wrote to the company, made notes."
"I was so grateful." "Gratitude," Miss Marple murmured.
"It can be quite the lockpick." Elspeth clasped her hands tighter. He was kind at first, quiet. Then there were gifts.
"Little things."
Books of poetry, small parcels of tea, and that wretched jar of quince jelly. I told myself it was friendship. "But sometimes kindness feels like being measured." Miss Marple nodded gently. "And you suspect now that you were being weighed for something larger." Tears shimmered in Elspeth's eyes. "He said the jelly was a gesture, a comfort. He even offered to taste it first, but I refused. It seemed too intimate somehow. And then the smell, or the almond," Miss Marple said. Elspeth nodded. "When Arthur was ill last winter, the doctor asked if he'd eaten anything strange.
I said no, but now—"
I remember a cordial. Mr. Linton had brought it after choir practice, said it would warm him." Miss Marple's voice stayed calm.
"And he recovered that time?"
"Yes, a dreadful night, but he lived." "Then perhaps," Miss Marple said quietly, "someone learned from the rehearsal." There was a pause, filled only by the ticking clock. Miss Marple reached for her teacup, then changed her mind. "Did Mr. Linton visit this week?" Elspeth hesitated. "He came yesterday. I told him I'd rather handle the paperwork myself." He smiled, but it wasn't kindness. He said, "Of course, Mrs. Daring, I only meant to tidy what was left untied." And then he left that note. "Do not forget." Miss Marple looked toward the bureau. "And what remains untied, my dear?" "The annuity papers and—" She glanced nervously toward the pantry. "Another parcel came this morning." Miss Marple rose. On the sideboard sat a brown paper parcel, nearly identical to the first. The same blue string, the same precise knot. But this one bore no label at all. "Untied," she murmured.
"And yet so neatly bound." A knock sounded at the door. Constable Pritchard.
His boots left polite damp prints on the mat. "Beg pardon, Miss Marple, Mrs. Daring. Postmistress says another parcel like this one was meant for the vicar's wife last week. Same wrapping, same string, never delivered." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Interesting. Perhaps we've caught a generosity epidemic." He looked puzzled. "Beg pardon? Never mind. Continue your patrol, Constable. But do be careful where the lane forks." When he left, she turned to Elspeth. "Did Mr. Linton ever speak of bitter almonds?"
Elspeth blinked.
"Yes, once. He said they were a natural remedy, quite harmless in small doses. He had a bottle of essence, I think."
"It smelled exactly like the jelly," Miss Marple finished.
How curious that harm so often hides in the guise of helpfulness. That afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to Mr. Linton's shop. The air smelled faintly of ink and polished wood. He greeted her with habitual politeness, though his eyes flickered when he saw her expression. "Miss Marple."
"Always a pleasure. How may I—" "Ask questions," she said pleasantly. "It's a habit of mine." He laughed nervously.
"And you always find answers, I suppose." "Only when people assist me." She glanced around the shop, noting the tidy shelves, the gleaming glass jar of boiled sweets on the counter. Her gaze fell on his ledger. "Might I see your accounts again?" "I promise I shan't copy them." He hesitated, then obliged. The page lay open, and her eyes darted to the margins. Faint penciled initials beside small entries, BA and tonic, 1,6D, another, essence, 3D, bitter. You have an orderly mind, Mr. Linton, though I wonder what BA stands for. He coloured slightly. Just an old note, nothing of consequence. Ah, Miss Marple said. Bitter almonds, perhaps? The chemist would know. His lips tightened. Such old-fashioned things. I bought it for flavouring. My late aunt used to add a drop to pastry. How touching, Miss Marple murmured. Did you also inherit her corks? He frowned. Corks? You see, she continued, voice light as air, Dr. Haydock mentioned a bottle found uncorked in your storeroom. The cork was replaced with one whittled far too smooth to seal properly. Curious workmanship, unless of course one wished easy access. His colour drained. Miss Marple, you misunderstand. I hope so, she said kindly, because understanding is often uncomfortable. Outside, the bell above the door jingled as she left. The street smelled of rain. At the corner, she paused, considering the next stitch in her pattern. A rhyme drifted from the schoolyard. Children's voices, high and sweet. A sweet for the sorrowing, a gift for the kind. Leave it at the door, and none shall mind. She stood very still. Children repeat what they hear, she said softly. But who taught them the verse? The answer arrived the next morning from Tommy Jones, triumphant. It was the man with the bicycle bell, miss. He whistled it first. Then he gave Elsie a peppermint. Miss Marple smiled. Indeed, the small rehearsals of greater crimes. That evening she sat with her knitting untouched, watching the twilight fold over the village. Each clue lay before her like a neat row of stitches, the annuity, the jars, the essence, the blue string, the bicycle. And now, motive. Mr. Linton had courted Elspeth's trust not for affection but for access to her late husband's modest fortune, safeguarded only by a clause against foul play. If she died quietly, he might seem merely helpful, her affairs already under his tidy control. But if suspicion rose, the clause would turn to a barrier, and he had been careful, so careful, to make suspicion seem unthinkable. Miss Marple's eyes softened.
Such tidy evil, she murmured.
Like a well-creased paper parcel, only wicked in what it hides. She wrote in her notebook, evidence, identical string, false kindness, annuity motive, second parcel prepared, ledger marked BA, bottle uncorked, then beneath next, demonstration. The fog thickened once more around Hollyhock Cottage. From far down the lane came the soft, deliberate ring of a bicycle bell, not cheerful now, but punctual, expectant. Miss Marple set her pen aside. Time, she said quietly, to open the door, just enough. She folded her shawl, extinguished the lamp, and prepared her small plan. A gathering, a test, a truth revealed in lamplight, and, somewhere beyond the hedges, the faintest whisper of tires on wet gravel, the sound of a man who believed himself unseen. And Miss Marple, hearing the faint imagined ring of that bell, knew the time had come to ask the right question in precisely the wrong place. Chapter 7. The chemist's bell gave a neat, professional chime, the kind that suggests medicine might be found even for the inconvenient ailments of the soul. The shop smelled of iodine and lavender, glass and caution. Rows of bottles stood like little sermons against folly, each bearing a label to remind one that comfort,
if mismeasured, could be very far from kind. Good morning. Mr. Keene, Miss Marple said, laying her gloves upon the counter with the air of someone about to ask for smelling salts when, in truth, she required only information. Miss Marple.
What can I do for you?
Tonic, perhaps? A little valerian?
His tone was bustling and benevolent. He liked to feel necessary. Just a question. Have you, in the past fortnight, sold any, how shall we put it delicately, almond essences of a more
spirited character?
Mr. Keene's eyebrows met for a confidential conference. We did have a gentleman paid cash, declined a receipt, asked a few too clever questions and left a dusting on my counter. I spent a quarter hour banishing. Not sugar, mind, it clung.
He wore a dark coat and spectacles and was particular about his paper wrappings. Asked for extra. I see, said Miss Marple mildly. And his left cuff?
Mr. Keene blinked. Dusty, now you mention it. Why, Miss Marple? You do notice things. One tries, she replied. It saves time later. She left the chemist with nothing in her bag and quite a great deal in her mind. Outside, the day was lowering into a thoughtful grey. Wind came up the lane in little rehearsals of a storm yet to arrive. Constable Pritchard found her by the green and fell into step with the anxious relief of a man who prefers his mysteries in company. "News from Much Benham, miss," he said, holding his hat. "Draper's invoice confirms it. Blue parcel twine, that exact pale shade. Only purchaser in the last quarter is Linton's bookshop for the wrapping of hymnals. How economical of Providence," Miss Marple murmured. "A habit that ties up hymns can tie up other things too." He looked pained.
You think it's him then?
"I think the twine is faithful," she said gently.
And men, Constable, are not always as constant as their habits. They paused by the vicarage hedge,
where the yew's shadow lay like a listening ear. Mrs. Price Ridley and the vicar's wife were approaching with a rustle of determined discretion. "Have you heard?" Mrs. Price Ridley began without preamble, "that Mrs. Daring has been receiving anonymous encouragements?"
The nerve? Have courage indeed.
"Courage for what? For keeping breath in her lungs, perhaps?" Miss Marple said pleasantly. "One likes to see it carried on." The ladies flustered and moved on with a chorus of "oh dears." The constable glanced sideways. "That's the closest to a scold I've ever heard from you, miss." "Gossip is a broom," Miss Marple said. "It sweeps facts into corners if one is not watchful." Mr. Linton's bell gave its usual nervous jingle when she pushed open the bookshop door. The light inside was polite, the dust domestic. The rows of books so well behaved one might have imagined they shelved themselves from a sense of duty. "Miss Marple," Mr. Linton exclaimed, appearing from the back with a smile too quick to be entirely comfortable. "What a delight." "Good afternoon," she said, removing her gloves one finger at a time. "I've come for two small things, a book of psalms and a demonstration." "A demonstration? You are known for your parcel wrapping," she said kindly. "I should like to see it done. Imagine I am a timid parishioner. I have bought a hymn book for my niece. How would you secure it against the perils of travel?" He laughed, a dry, papery sound. "Why, like this, of course." He drew paper, folded with crisp thumb creases, measured string, looped and crossed, and finished with a draper's neat, decisive knot. "Exactly so," Miss Marple murmured. "And were you to select a jar cap from a drawer without looking, would your hand be sure?" He paused, the string tightening in his fingers. "I'm afraid I don't follow." "Oh, forgive me," Miss Marple said, all gentleness. "It is only that mismatched caps trouble me. So untidy, if a tone can trip." His did.
"I don't deal in jars, Miss Marple." "No," she agreed.
"You deal in impressions." "Much safer." He slid the parcel across to her, but it hovered a fraction above the counter, as if the hand that released it had second thoughts. "And your cuff," she added almost idly, "has the most obstinate sheen. Not sugar, not dust. Something that clings." He looked down and brushed at it. "Books are dusty things, only on their covers," she replied, and left him to the company of his ledger. Elspeth Daring, when Miss Marple arrived at Hollyhock Cottage, was standing by the pantry door with the courage of someone who has decided to be brave in exactly the wrong room.
"He was here," she whispered.
"Mr. Linton, he brought a book of verses and said it was balm. He asked after my sleep and stood there by the pantry as if..."
"As if he expected a performance. What did you say?"
"That I prefer scripture," she said with a ghost of a smile. "Oh, Miss Marple, he looked so kind and so far away at the same moment." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "Men can be at different distances behind their eyes." On the table lay a folded note, the ink not quite dry. "Courage brings comfort," it read. The hand was neat, the tail of the final flourish drooping as if the pen had remembered it was held on a moving bicycle. "Would you come tonight?" Miss Marple asked gently.
"At 9 o'clock to the vicarage parlour?"
"I should like a very small company, yourself, Mr. Linton, the constable, and one or two ladies who understand jam."
"I mean to conduct a demonstration," Elspeth swallowed.
"A demonstration of what?" "Of the difference," Miss Marple said, "between gratitude and consent. Before evening, Miss Marple paid one last call, back to Mr. Keene, who obligingly laid out 3 small bottles on a tray, a proper almond flavouring for pastry, a household essence entirely innocent of mischief, and kept locked, another that the chemist did not sell, for identification only, he said, nervous and proud. "I keep it to warn off the foolish." "Quite right," said Miss Marple. She brought the tray to the window, watched the light thread itself through glass and liquid, and nodded. "You see? Even when scent is disguised, behaviour remains. It blooms under a touch of heat. It clings where sugar does not." Mr. Keene dabbed his counter with a cloth already much abused by this education. "Will you need—"
"Only your good word," she replied.
"And perhaps your window to rattle, if the storm is kind." By 8, a wind had set its hands upon St. Mary Mead and shaken it gently to see what might fall out. The vicarage parlour was all lamplight and policy. The vicar's wife had put out lemon biscuits as if justice were better with refreshment. Mrs. Blount arrived with the gravity of a woman attending both a christening and a trial. Constable Pritchard polished his boots with his trouser legs and tried not to look at the door. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Blount whispered, "if this is about that jar, I feel I ought to say—" "It is about a trick," Miss Marple said, "and about how tricks behave under observation." At 5 minutes to 9, Mr. Linton entered, punctuality varnished as virtue. His coat was dark, his spectacles tidy, his smile tidy too. He inclined his head to the vicar's wife, to Mrs. Blount, to Elspeth, lingering just long enough to suggest solicitude. "I've brought a psalter," he announced, holding up a wrapped parcel as if piety could be parcelled. "Thought it might give comfort." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "I imagine you did." She had set the parlour table as one sets a domestic altar, 2 identical jars standing like twin saints, saucers, a single clean spoon, a folded handkerchief.
"And under a napkin, the chemist's tray. We shall begin with a game," she said.
"Mr. Linton, would you be so kind as to tell us which of these 2 jars is better presented, better clarity, better set, better invitation to the eye?" It took him only a glance. "Why, this one," he said, laying his fingers upon the jar that shone a shade too beautifully under the lamplight.
"Anyone can see, anyone who knows the trick," Miss Marple said softly.
"Thank you." A puff of agitation moved through the room like a draught through curtains. The constable cleared his throat. The vicar's wife looked at the saucers as if they were about to offer opinions on morality. "And now," Miss Marple went on, lifting the chosen jar, "we watch how kindness behaves when warmed." She placed the smallest smear upon a saucer and, with a match, warmed the plate's underside for an instant. The jelly gave that telltale bloom, varnish rather than melt, and the room breathed in, then out, together. "Almond," said Mrs. Blount. "Reluctant, precise." "A ghost," said the vicar's wife. "A habit," Miss Marple said. "This jar has been managed."
"Its lid," she held up the cap, "does not match its body."
Its sugar seal was lifted and persuaded to sit again. "The knot upon its paper is the neat confession of a draper's pupil, and the dust it leaves upon a cuff is not sugar. It is a crystalline friend that clings like policy." Mr. Linton laughed, an unconvincing social sound. "My dear Miss Marple, you've made a romance of a jar." "Romance?" she echoed. "No, arithmetic." She reached for the chemist's tray, uncovering it. "Mr. Keene will say what he observed. The gentleman who declined a receipt, the dust upon the counter, the request for extra paper. The draper in Much Benham will speak to his invoice for blue string, delivered to your shop, for hymnals. And Mrs. Perkins has kept the undelivered parcel that changed its mind at her counter."
All tidy, his smile thinned.
"You overestimate coincidences." "I never do," she said. "I only stack them neatly, like books."
"Like parcels."
"Like plans." There was a tiny ting as something shifted in his pocket, no more than a bicycle bell settling upon itself. Elspeth's hands clutched one another until the knuckles showed white. "You cannot prove intent," he said suddenly, voice lower.
"A jar, a knot, a string, what are they?"
"Kindness, carefully arranged." "Precisely," Miss Marple replied, and her voice, while still gentle, acquired the sort of warmth with which one irons a stubborn crease. Kindness arranged too carefully becomes theatre. You rehearsed last winter with a cordial that did not suit Mr. Daring. You practiced your rapping on hymnals until the knot obeyed you. You bought essences and wrote BA in your ledger margins, as if the alphabet could keep your conscience. You left gifts at a door and notes that mimicked sympathy, all toward a quiet end. She inclined her head.
And a clause. He flinched despite himself.
Clause?
The annuity, said Miss Marple.
It fears foul play. A sudden, peaceful widow is easier to guide than a living woman with questions. You would become the helpful man with tidy paperwork.
The one who knows where the signatures belong.
Arithmetic, Mr. Linton, not romance. Outside, the wind pressed its face to the glass. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Mr. Linton's hand lifted and fell, as if the air had become heavy. The bicycle bell in his pocket gave the smallest, traitorous chime. Constable Pritchard stepped forward, not yet the law, but nearly. Sir? Mr. Linton looked around at the room that had turned itself quietly into a witness. His smile tried to return and thought better of it. How very
imaginative, he said at last.
If I had meant harm, Miss Marple, I should hardly have offered to taste the jelly, would I? That, Miss Marple said kindly, is the loveliest line in the play. A silence gathered. Elspeth's breath came steadier now, as if the room had tilted and she was learning to stand upon the new floor. Mrs. Blount folded her arms in the particular way of women who have made jam all their lives and can smell false economy from 3 houses. Away Miss Marple replaced the cap upon the safe jar and covered it with a clean cloth, a small domestic absolution. 9 o'clock, she said very softly, as if telling the time to a child. Such a good hour for truth. And then, as if the village itself wished to make an entrance, the first fat drop of rain struck the window pane. One, and then another, like a tap from a gloved finger, promising company. Chapter 8. The vicarage parlour had that hushed brightness peculiar to rooms where the truth has been invited and is deciding whether to sit down. The lamplight steadied.
Rain ticked at the glass.
On the centre table, the 2 jars waited, twin amber eyes regarding the company with polite indifference. Miss Marple did not raise her voice. She rarely needed to. We have seen, she said, how jelly behaves when warmed, how a cap confesses its mismatch, how string tells a story about the hand that tied it. Now we must ask why anyone would go to such trouble merely to comfort a widow. Mr. Linton's smile was careful. Comfort is never mere, Miss Marple. Some of us make a practice of it. Yes, she agreed softly. A practice. Rehearsed, refined, and wrapped. Constable Pritchard stood by the door with the unshowy solidness of an upright chair. Mrs. Blount, Queen of Preserves, sat forward a fraction. The vicar's wife paled but held her ground. Elspeth Daring, shoulders set, folded her hands in her lap as if to keep them from shaking. Miss Marple continued in her gentle schoolroom tone. Arithmetic, Mr. Linton. A modest annuity that stops at once if the company suspects foul play. A woman isolated by grief. A helpful man with access to her papers and her gratitude. Remove the woman quietly, and there is no quarrel over signatures, no questions about clauses, only a tidy procession of forms. She inclined her head a tick.
You dislike quarrels.
You prefer neatness, he laughed, but the sound fell like paper. If I were what you suggest, should I not have used something vulgar and common? Why this elaborate theatre with jars and jellies? Because theatre persuades an audience to applaud its own undoing, Miss Marple said. A gift at the door tells the neighbours to call it kindness. A flavour tells a body that it is safe. A note, have courage, do not forget, tells a mind how to narrate its own danger. Mr. Keene the chemist had not been invited. His sworn statement, however, lay folded on the table. Miss Marple rested a finger upon it. You bought essence not approved for cakes. You declined a receipt. You left that clinging dust on Mr. Keene's counter and on your cuff. You purchased draper's twine for hymnals and practiced your knot until it tied itself. She turned a saucer a few degrees. You even rehearsed last winter with a cordial that didn't agree with Mr. Daring. The bicycle bell in Mr. Linton's pocket gave a minute, traitorous chime. He flattened his hand over it as if to still a small animal. Coincidences, he said. All of them. Coincidences, Miss Marple repeated. Arrive in 2s and 3s. Yours arrive with paper caps and ledger marks. She opened the ledger she had borrowed under his obliging eye and turned it toward the room. A neat column, small initials penciled at the margin. BA not book account, bitter almonds. A privaté de mémoire. One develops such habits when one is accustomed to parceling both goods and people. He tried a shrug. A drop for cake. You know how old recipes are, Mrs. Blount sniffed, the sound a ruling.
Not for jelly, sir.
Not in my kitchen, Elspeth spoke for the first time. And the note you left today, to courage brings comfort. Why did your hand shake on the last flourish? Mr. Linton turned toward her, startled.
It did not. Miss Marple's tone remained daylight kind.
It always does when written on a bicycle handle, she said. The downstroke tilts, like the ones Tommy Jones saw you carrying to her door. Like the one the postmistress received and never sent. She lifted a second folded sheet. Mrs. Perkins's witness, secured by tidy pins. Undelivered because you changed your mind and delivered it yourself. One step, one bell, one careful knot. The room had narrowed. Even the rain seemed to lean closer. Mr. Linton's eyes went from jar to saucer to string and back again, like a man selecting an exit he could no longer see. Suppose, he said, choosing dignity now that charm had failed, suppose I wished to do her harm.
Why bring it here? Why let you make a show of it?
Miss Marple smiled as if he had offered her the choicest biscuit. Because tidy men cannot resist a display of competence, she said. You knew at a glance which jar was too clear. You reached for it instinctively because you trained yourself to admire your own trick. You thought no one would understand what you had learned to do. I offered to taste it, he insisted, voice low. And if nothing had been said, Miss Marple returned, you would have. A sip is less than a spoon. A gentleman's gesture buys applause, and another day...
One does not light the fuse while the audience watches the match. Constable Pritchard shifted, boots faint on the rug. So if you'd come along, on what charge?
Mr. Linton snapped, his tidy voice frayed. The charge, Miss Marple said gently, is for those who draft them to name. Mine is to remove the disguise. Mr. Keen's affidavit will say, your bottle's cork was shaved smooth for easy entry and exit. The draper's invoice will place that string in your shop. The postmistress will produce the undelivered parcel. Mrs. Blount and I will demonstrate again, if needed, what heat coaxes from doctored jelly. And Mrs. Daring, she looked kindly at Elspeth, will describe how kindness arrived and arranged the papers for her comfort. Outside, thunder murmured like a gentleman clearing his throat before saying something awkward. Mr. Linton's shoulders sagged. For a hanging moment he seemed only tired, a man whose cleverness had outrun his courage, and circled back to bite his sleeve. He set the parcel he had brought, his salter, on the table, and smoothed the paper.
A reflex.
It was never personal, he said suddenly, and in that shabby sentence confessed more than he intended. It was the system, these small annuities, these women alone who need someone to...
tidy things.
You cannot imagine the chaos in their drawers. Miss Marple's expression did not change, only softened around the eyes. I can imagine it perfectly, she said. And I can also imagine the comfort of a room you do not own but wish to arrange. She nodded toward the door.
Constable, Pritchard stepped forward, unobtrusive even now, as if escorting a difficult hymn out of the wrong key. Mr. Linton did not struggle.
The bicycle bell chimed once more in his pocket, soft, apologetic. I meant to be kind, he said into the general air. You meant? Miss Marple answered. To be believed. He looked at Elspeth, searching for something that would absolve him. She gave him nothing, only the weary politeness one offers a man who has overstayed his welcome. They went out into the rain together, Pritchard patient,
Linton diminished.
The storm, not much interested in human economies. Silence remained a moment in the parlour. Then, with the innate practicality of village life reasserting itself, the vicar's wife pressed a biscuit upon Elspeth, and Mrs. Blount wiped the rim of a safe jar with a clean cloth, because that is what one does with jars. Elspeth turned to Miss Marple.
If you hadn't, my dear, Miss Marple said.
You had already done the bravest thing. You disliked a gift. She placed a gentle hand atop Elspeth's. One must distrust what arrives prettily at the door and insists upon gratitude. Elspeth's breath steadied. What shall I do with the papers now? Read them by daylight, Miss Marple said, and let the vicar's wife sit with you. 2 cups of tea, remember, better than 1. Mrs. Blount cleared her throat.
And the jelly?
Miss Marple replaced the cap upon the untouched, honest jar and covered it with a fresh napkin. Domestic liturgy performed with precision. This one goes back to the pantry where it belongs. The other will accompany the constable to Mr. Keene, under lock. There is such a thing as respectable evidence. They stepped into the vestibule together. The door stood open a little way. Rain drew thin silver lines across the step. Beyond, the village had that scrubbed look it wears after storms, when everything mean has been chased under the hedges to think about what it's done. Listen, the vicar's wife said, surprised. The hollyhocks, they were tapping the windows with their wet, papery faces, nodding as if pleased to be included. Miss Marple smiled. Doors must open now and then to let the weather in, she said, else the air goes stale. As they watched, the parlour door swung itself the last inch and closed with a sound both soft and final. Miss Marple took up her knitting bag, and in that quiet closing, the narrator might have said had there been one, the village's breath returned, the storm easing, the hollyhocks lifting to the lamplight, and Miss Marple's needles resuming their patient, forgiving rhythm. She did not need a narrator. She had tea to pour, and a widow to walk home, and a note to write to a nephew who would enjoy the tale precisely as much as it deserved. Outside, St. Mary Mead reset itself, shops, bells, respectable pavements, like a carefully tied parcel that, having failed to deceive, elected to be merely useful again. And as the constable's footsteps faded, Miss Marple gently covered the true quince with a clean cloth, saying that some doors must be shut so others may safely open. Candlelight Mysteries Channel message. And so, dear listener, our tale draws to its quiet close, the flame reduced to a soft and steady glow, the shadows retreating once more into silence. In St. Mary Mead, the air grows calm again, and Miss Marple's knitting needles resume their patient rhythm, each stitch a meditation on human nature, its tenderness, its folly, and its unspoken griefs. Perhaps tonight, as you sit by your own flickering light, you will think of Hollyhock Cottage, of the secrets left upon its doorstep, and of the truth that finally came knocking. For in every mystery there lies not only the darkness of what was done, but the light of what is learned. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Candlelight Mysteries, where every secret is revealed by the soft glow of candlelight. Until next time, dear listener,
Another secret fades.
by candlelight.